A 25-year-old man stands on a ship deck off the coast of Egypt, waiting for word that his father is dead. He does not know yet that within 6 years he will humble the Knights of Rhodes, break the kingdom of Hungary in a single afternoon, and stand outside the gates of Vienna itself. He does not know that history will call him magnificent, and that his own people will call him something else entirely, a lawgiver. He only knows that the empire his father built through fear is now his to either lose or transform. Suleiman was born on the 6th of November 1494 in the Black Sea town of Trabzon, the only son of the man who would become Sultan Selim I. His grandfather Bayezid II gave him his first taste of power at just 17, appointing him governor of Kaffa in Crimea, a frontier post far from the comforts of the capital. It was a deliberate test, the kind the Ottoman dynasty had used for generations, because in this family, sons did not simply inherit power. They earned it, or they died trying to seize it from their brothers. Suleiman would later govern Manisa in western Anatolia under his father's reign, learning the machinery of administration, while his father waged brutal wars against rivals both foreign and domestic. It was an apprenticeship written in blood and paperwork, and Suleiman absorbed both lessons completely. His father, Selim I, was a man history remembers as ruthless, even by the standards of his own violent age, a sultan who expanded Ottoman territory dramatically, but left behind a court thick with suspicion. So when Selim died of illness during a campaign in September of 1520 at the age of 49, the empire held its breath. Successions in the Ottoman world were rarely peaceful. Brothers killed brothers, sons plotted against fathers. But Suleiman was, remarkably, an only son. There would be no fratricidal war this time, no purge of rival claimants soaked in family blood. He ascended almost quietly, and the sword-girding ceremony that made it official took place on the 30th of September 1494, sealing his position as the 10th Sultan of the House of Osman. What kind of ruler would he be? The empire did not have to wait long to find out. One of Suleiman's very first acts was to lift a punishing trade ban his father had placed on merchants dealing with Iran, and he personally ordered compensation paid to those who had suffered under it. It was a small gesture, but a telling one. Here was a new sultan signaling that his reign might carry a different temperament than his father's. Yet gentleness, if that is even the right word, would never be the whole story of Suleiman. Because barely a year into his rule, he was already leading armies north, toward a fortress city that had defied Ottoman ambition for decades. Belgrade had resisted the great conqueror Mehmed II himself, decades earlier. It was the gateway to Central Europe, and in the summer of 1521, Suleiman personally commanded the siege that finally broke it. The city fell. Word spread across a nervous Europe that a formidable new sultan had arrived, one who could succeed where even legends had failed. But Belgrade was only the opening note. Suleiman turned his forces toward the island of Rhodes, home to the Knights Hospitaller, a crusading order that had used the island as a base to raid Ottoman shipping for over 2 centuries. The siege was brutal and long, stretching across months of 1522, but by the end of the year the knights surrendered and were permitted to leave the island under terms of truce. 2 of the most stubborn obstacles to Ottoman power in the region were gone within Suleiman's first 2 years on the throne. What made this young sultan so effective, so fast? Part of the answer walked beside him almost everywhere he went. A man named Ibrahim, a former slave who had become Suleiman's closest childhood friend and would rise to become his Grand Vizier, the most powerful official in the empire beneath the Sultan himself. Their bond was unusually intimate for a relationship built across such a steep hierarchy of power, and for years Ibrahim was indispensable, a brilliant administrator and diplomat who helped Suleiman project Ottoman power across 3 continents. But loyalty at the summit of absolute power is rarely permanent, and this friendship, so central to the early triumphs of the reign, was already carrying the seeds of a much darker chapter still years away. For now, though, the campaigns continued, and none would prove more consequential than what happened in Hungary in the summer of 1526. At Mohács, Suleiman's forces met the army of the young Hungarian king Louis II. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. By its end, the Hungarian army was effectively destroyed, and King Louis himself drowned fleeing the field. According to most historical accounts, the Kingdom of Hungary, one of the great powers of Central Europe, essentially collapsed as a unified state in that single catastrophic afternoon. It was a turning point not just for Hungary, but for the entire continent, opening the path toward Ottoman influence deep into the heart of Europe and setting up a rivalry with the Habsburg dynasty that would define the rest of Suleiman's life. 3 years later, in 1529, Suleiman pushed even further, laying siege to Vienna itself, the capital of Habsburg Austria. Imagine the fear inside those city walls, watching the largest army most of them had ever seen encircle their home, knowing that Belgrade had fallen, that Rhodes had fallen, that Hungary had been shattered in an afternoon. But Vienna held. Autumn rains, stretched supply lines, and fierce resistance forced Suleiman to withdraw before winter closed in. He tried again in 1532, and again the city did not break. Historians generally agree that these failed sieges marked the practical limit of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe, the high water mark beyond which the empire, however magnificent, could not permanently push. And so the Sultan, who had seemed unstoppable for a decade, turned his gaze elsewhere, southward into the Mediterranean, eastward into Asia. But here is the question that hovers over everything we think we know about this Sultan. Was he truly the tolerant, cultured lawgiver that history often paints him as? Or was that reputation, like so many royal reputations, carefully built and polished by the very court chroniclers who depended on his favor? The truth, as it usually is, sits somewhere uncomfortable in between. Because, while Suleiman was reforming law, patronizing poets, and commissioning breathtaking architecture, he was also capable of the same ruthless calculations that defined every Ottoman sultan before him. Consider what happened to Ibrahim, the boyhood friend who had risen to become Grand Vizier, the man Suleiman had once seemed inseparable from. In 1536, Ibrahim was executed on Suleiman's own order, strangled inside the palace, his enormous wealth and power apparently having grown into a threat, whether real or perceived, that the Sultan could no longer tolerate. The precise reasons remain debated among historians to this day, some pointing to court rivalries and whispered accusations, others to Ibrahim's own overreaching ambition. What is not disputed is the outcome. A friendship that had shaped the first 15 years of the reign ended in a single night, behind closed doors, without trial, the way so many things ended in the Ottoman court. It would not be the last time Suleiman ordered the death of someone close to him. As his sons grew older, rivalry over the succession poisoned the Sultan's own household. His son Mustafa, popular with the army and seen by many as a natural heir, became by the early 1550s a focus of concern and, according to most historical accounts, suspicion of disloyalty encouraged by rivals within the harem and court. In 1553, Suleiman had Mustafa executed, reportedly strangled in the Sultan's own tent during a military campaign. 8 years later, another son, Bayezid, was executed as well after a failed rebellion against his father. 2 sons, dead by their father's command, within the span of less than a decade. The empire's greatest lawgiver was also, in the most literal sense, the author of his own family's tragedy. How do you reconcile the architect of some of history's most celebrated legal reforms with a man who ordered his own children killed? Perhaps the answer lies in understanding what the Ottoman throne actually demanded of the people who sat on it. Succession in this dynasty had, for generations, been a matter of survival, brothers murdering brothers to prevent future civil war. Suleiman himself had been spared that horror only because he had no siblings to contend with. But his own sons multiplied that old danger many times over, and in the calculus of imperial survival, a stable empire was worth more than a father's love. That does not excuse what happened. It simply explains, in the coldest possible terms, the logic that a sultan lived inside. And yet, away from the tent where his sons met their end, Suleiman was building something that would outlast every battle he ever fought. He earned the Ottoman title Kanuni, meaning the lawgiver, because he tasked his chief judicial officer, Ebusud Effendi, with merging centuries of sultanic decree with Islamic religious law into a single, coherent legal code. This system remained the backbone of Ottoman justice for more than 300 years after his death. Under his reign, different religious communities across the empire, including Jews and Christians, were generally permitted to govern significant aspects of their own affairs and preserve their own customs, so long as they accepted Ottoman authority. It would be inaccurate to call this modern religious equality, because Muslims held clear legal and social advantages throughout the empire. But by the standards of 16th century Europe, where religious minorities routinely faced expulsion or worse, the Ottoman approach under Suleiman allowed for a degree of coexistence that many contemporary Christian kingdoms did not offer their own religious minorities. Meanwhile, Istanbul itself was being transformed. The Sultan's chief architect, a man named Mimar Sinan, would go on to design or oversee several hundred structures across the empire: mosques, bridges, aqueducts, and public baths that still stand today. The great Suleiman I mosque complex, built under Sinan's direction, remains one of the defining monuments of Istanbul's skyline nearly 5 centuries later, a mountain of stone and light built to declare, permanently, that the Ottoman Empire had reached its cultural peak. Suleiman himself was no distant patron disconnected from this world of art. He wrote poetry under the pen name Muhibi, and by some counts left behind close to 3,000 poems exploring love, power, and the fleeting nature of earthly rule, themes that feel almost prophetic given everything we now know about how his story ends. There is one particular woman whose presence quietly reshaped the entire arc of this reign, and her rise itself reads like something out of fiction, except every detail is verified. Her name, at least the name history remembers her by, was Hurrem, known in the West as Roxolana, a woman of Slavic origin brought into the imperial harem, likely through the slave trade that fed the Sultan's household. What happened next had almost no precedent in Ottoman history. Rather than remaining simply one concubine among many, Hurrem became Suleiman's favorite, then his legal wife, an extraordinarily rare status for a woman in her position, and eventually a political force in her own right, corresponding with foreign rulers and wielding influence within the palace that historians still debate the full extent of. Her sons, rather than Mustafa's line, would ultimately inherit the throne, and many historians believe her influence played some role in the court, intrigues that led to Mustafa's execution, though the precise mechanics of that palace politics remain genuinely disputed among scholars. What is certain is that Hurrem's transformation from captive to co-ruler in all but formal title represents one of the most remarkable individual journeys in Ottoman history, and it happened entirely within the private walls of Suleiman's own household. Beyond the palace walls, the empire's reach kept expanding in directions many people today rarely associate with the Ottomans at all. Under the command of the fearsome admiral known as Barbarossa, born Khayr al-Din, the Ottoman navy crushed a combined Spanish and Venetian fleet off the coast of Greece in 1538, a victory that secured Ottoman naval dominance across much of the Mediterranean for decades to come, right up until the famous Battle of Lepanto more than 30 years later. Ottoman forces even ventured as far as the Indian Ocean, launching an ambitious but ultimately unsuccessful attempt to dislodge Portuguese power from the Indian port city of Diu. Closer to Ottoman territory, Suleiman's armies pushed into Yemen and captured the port of Aden, opening trade routes toward the Red Sea and beyond. This was not simply a land empire clinging to Europe's edge. Under Suleiman, Ottoman ambitions stretched from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Indian Ocean, a scale of reach that few other rulers in that century could match. But every empire, no matter how magnificent, eventually meets the limits of one man's body and one man's time. By the 1560s, Suleiman was an old man by the standards of his era. In his late 60s, still leading campaigns from horseback despite failing health, still driven by the same restless ambition that had carried him to Belgrade as a young sultan more than 4 decades earlier. In the summer of 1566, he set out on what would become his final campaign, marching once more into Hungary to besiege the fortress town of Szigetvár. It was, in many ways, a strange echo of where his story had begun. Another Hungarian siege, another test of Ottoman will against a stubborn defended wall. But this time, the Sultan who arrived at the walls was not the same man who had shattered the Hungarian army at Mohács 40 years earlier. Suleiman died in his tent during the night of the 5th or 6th of September 1566, near Szigetvár, likely from natural causes related to his advanced age and declining health. He was 71 years old and had ruled for 46 years, longer than any sultan before or after him in the entire 600-year history of the Ottoman dynasty. According to most historical accounts, his death was kept secret from the army for weeks by his advisors, who feared that news of the sultan's passing might collapse morale and unravel the ongoing siege before it concluded and before a stable succession could be arranged back in the capital. Imagine that scene for a moment. An army continuing to fight and march under the banner of a sultan who was already gone, his final campaign concluding under a silence maintained by the very men who had served him. What do we make, in the end, of a man who built one of history's most enduring legal systems and personally ordered the deaths of 2 of his own sons, who expanded religious tolerance within his borders while crushing entire kingdoms beyond them, who wrote delicate poetry about the impermanence of power while ruling for nearly half a century as one of the most powerful men on earth? Maybe that contradiction is the entire point. Maybe there was never a version of absolute power in that century, in that world, that could exist without cruelty sitting right beside genuine cultural achievement. Suleiman's reign raised the Ottoman Empire's population to an estimated 25 million subjects, and pushed its borders to their greatest extent in the empire's 600-year existence. The mosques his architect built still stand. The legal code he commissioned shaped Ottoman society for centuries after his body was carried back from that Hungarian battlefield. And yet the tent where his sons were strangled on his own orders is remembered too, because history, when it is told honestly, does not get to choose only the flattering half of the story. So here is the question worth sitting with. When we call a ruler magnificent, are we describing the empire he built, or simply the version of him that survived long enough to be carved into stone? Write in the comments which side of Suleiman's story you find more revealing, the lawgiver or the father who gave the order that ended his own son's life. And if this kind of history, the kind that refuses to simplify people into heroes or villains, is what you come here for, subscribe, because there are far more stories like this one still waiting to be told.